My name is Chico Sierra. I'm a visual artist originally from El Paso, Texas, now residing in Midwest, Kansas City area. Pronouns he, him. Identify as Chicano, indigenous, and yeah, that's what I do. Visual artist, painter mostly, yeah. Shown regularly in galleries around town and done some murals around Kansas City as well. I think I'd like to view myself as a sociologist in a way, but sort of rudimentary, like starting off with almost zero knowledge of like my own identity. So I think that sort of spawned a curiosity in like culture, like human culture as a whole, especially the culture of people whose sort of history has been erased through colonialism and not trying to reclaim it because a lot of it, necessarily isn't mine, but just sort of trying to understand my own identity through like exploring identities that may have been like erased over time. And a lot of that started off as just an exploration of symbolism and spiritual motifs, but repurposed to like explore ideas of like scientific ideas, like scientific methods, sort of as a practice that began before, as humans explored nature through storytelling, which in turn became like spirituality or religion, and especially people groups whose identity and spirituality is based in nature. I think a lot of it was just sort of figuring out the world around them, and through that, I think it's sort of a science, it's sort of just doing what we all do, is trying to figure out why we're here and what's going on, and so sort of using that language to sort of retell the story as like these people were exploring their world and sort of came up with a new language, and now it's shifted into like using different iconography of like more modern times, especially that of like revolution, repurposed Catholicism, like saints and stuff like that, and sort of doing what a lot of folks from the global South have done in the past, which is repurpose saints and Catholic sort of deities, or whatever you want to call them, like spiritual figures, as and then sort of reshifting the focus on like on common people, I guess I would say, as the sort of saviors of humanity and culture, sort of like bridging gaps in history, if that makes sense. I grew up in El Paso, Texas. Borders like right there, like we're connected to Juarez, but there's also a military base there. So there's these very like, I don't know, there is the idea of these lines drawn all over the city I was born in. Was like, you can't go here and you can't go there. But because of like different circumstances, my stepdad was in the military, so I had access there. And being an American, but also being Chicano and having friends on the other side of the border, I had access to these things. And it's just like circumstance as to why I could go one place and couldn't go the other. And I think a lot of my work is about showing that the lines like divide are like based on things we can't control, like especially like a certain class of people have been sort of subjected to like divisions more than others, and there is a lot of it that is also like sort of being naive about what I'm doing, like what I'm working on. Like I have a specific feeling, and I'm trying to convey that in like a painting, and I try to let that sort of put everything together. A lot of people ask, why do you paint women? And it's not necessary, or why do you mostly paint like women, and like this sort of idea of feminine and masculine. It's like, I don't know if any of them are men or women, or if there's like if they are women or whatever. It's like culturally, the fabrics and stuff and the hair is more interesting, and like what people would identify. So it's more about the imagery, and I think some of it is also about the feeling. I mean, it is hard to even say, like, you just have this language that's like masculine or feminine. It's like two things, right? And you're given these two things, and it's like, but there's, in the feeling of the painting, it's a feeling. It's not a conversation about if it's like a male female. So you have these two options, and it's like, the reason is like, it is about the the cultural imagery, you know, and a lot of that is defined in like sort of what we perceive as like feminine, which is different when you're looking at it historically through like, especially like indigenous filter. Like there's a range of like what we would call genders, you know, like in those sort of specifics. So like only in the context of like European like sort of ideals and like Judeo-Christian values am I like thinking about or portraying women. It's about like the aesthetic of the cultural ties to those things, if that makes sense. Like, I mean, it's interesting now because I have a son, we both have long hair, and he's 4, and there's a lot of times where people are like, oh, you're such a pretty little girl, and he always says, I'm a kid. In this way that it's like, I don't know if what he's trying to say. I think he's just saying like, don't put that on me. I just have long hair, you know? So it's like that. It's just like, some people have been like, you know, why do these women have broad shoulders? And I'm like, I'm trying to portray like strength, so they're sort of standing, you know? And it has nothing to do with what I think their shoulders look like. It's just like, if you're standing straight up and you're like just sort of holding a giant sword or a giant machete or something, you're gonna stand a different way. Something that I've used quite a bit is the bull as a reference. And there's this idea of, I mean, growing up near Mexican border and having seen like, had this, the bull is like an identifier of machismo and like sort of like strength, but it is a domesticated animal in the worst way in different ways that they're used to like sort of in these aggressive forms of like sport, right? And I've always thought, if you leave it alone, if a bull is just a bull, left alone, it's not a violent thing. Like in most circumstances, you know, if threatened, if like in heat, all these circumstances are rare, you know, throughout like any animal's life, you know. We place these like ideas on them. When I used it in different circumstances, it is like a symbol for like people who are just trying to live their lives outside, like, you know, within the structure of like society and have community. And then in this picture, I don't think I've ever had a bull sort of like standing above a matador, sort of like holding it, but that sort of represents this like ruling class. And just, it's like this, we're useful in a way until that strength, until that like the weight is upon them, you know, until they like, it's like, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like wishful thinking, I think, but it is just a symbol for like the strength of common people who like have the true power, but are like sort of being weakened by this like entity. I've been like inspired by sort of illustrated advertisements from like Mexico and Central America from like the 20s, 30s, you know, like sort of and that sort of, those motifs sort of inspired a lot of, or were inspired by muralists, you know, like, so you have these like amazing murals. I mean, Diego Rivera's huge influence on like what I've done with my work, and his influence on sort of those like illustrators of that time. I like those posters a lot because they sort of like transition into like propaganda posters in Mexico and South America, and there's a cross influence between those and like, you know, socialist propaganda, both like in USSR and China, and I, you know, sort of think about those a lot. But like another influence is seeing like I just like makeup tutorials from like, because there's points of light, you know, in all these images where it's just like there's definitely specific like points of light that sort of bridge out very starkly. It's not like, you know, I kind of creating transitions. I like those like sort of, and what's funny is just like you talk about borders, but I like these like dark, like very stark circles that sort of transition out. It's interesting to me, like as far as color goes. And the intention is always to just sort of like get rid of any sort of idea of like restriction on like what I'm trying to convey, and a lot of that has to do with everything I'm thinking about at the time is like social justice, the plight of like the global South, like a certain feeling at the time, you know, because I think it all sort of, everybody's feeling it all at the same time, you know, like everybody's sort of going through something, but we're also dealing with being part of a world that's so connected, but we're all, and like knowing the circumstances of other people and being able to relate that. So it's like, I'm not sure if like we're able to really conceive of like how different what we're going through now as a people is how different it is than any other time, because we know all these things and we're just like, how do you, like being a person that creates art and trying to like function as a working artist, but also like knowing what's happening somewhere else in the world. Like, I mean, even talking about it now, it's like everybody knows what but like, you know, certain circumstances I'm talking about, you don't have to say anything, you just paint like an image, and like people kind of understand now. And it's like, there's almost, we have all these ways to communicate, and they've sort of been concentrated, you know, like if I put a watermelon on something, it's like that takes on a whole new meaning in some contexts than they did like 10, 15 years ago. And then it's, you know, within the last, like year, it's become definitely something, you're talking about one thing and one circumstance, and then it's like, but then from that conversation, it broadens out to like what's really happened, like what we think about our system of government and system of like just how the world's worked, economy, you know what I mean? Like just starting from that point and broadening out, it's like people are starting to connect with other people of like circumstances, I guess. Does that make sense? Sometimes I feel like they're just coming out as not thinking.